So my project was examining the potential effects of methane-fueled Bitcoin mining on California least tern breeding habitat. I was an environmental science major in undergrad, and we worked a lot with renewables. And you kind of run into the same problem with renewables over and over again, where it's very expensive and it requires a lot of overhead right away, and then it becomes profitable years and years down the line, as opposed to just creating like a fossil fuel plant, which is profitable pretty much immediately. So to get around that, we offer incentives and tax breaks, things like that. But that's very slow to get through legislatures, and it's easily repealed when you have another election, when you have another administration coming in. So I've always kind of looked for a situation where that doesn't exist and those pressures aren't there. I think we've kind of found that now with Bitcoin mining. So just very briefly, what's going on right now is financial institutions have gotten the ability to sell these things over the last year. So financial institutions around the world and governments around the world are all kind of aping in and buying tons and tons of it. The supply is getting very, very low and the price is going up. So the last really cheap source is mining. And everybody is starting renewable projects because the best way to mine is if your electricity costs are free. So the ones I'm interested in are methane fuel. It's already kind of collected as a byproduct of petroleum production and solid waste landfills. Like all of the infrastructure to harvest the gas and combust the gas is usually there. It's just there's not a good use case. It doesn't produce enough energy to power your town or anything like that. But if you have a small project like a server farm, it's kind of perfect for that. And it requires very low investment up front, talking about, I don't know, 100,000 to a million to build a plant instead of hundreds of millions. It's also good for mitigation because methane is a lot more potent than CO2. It has a higher warming potential, and it's usually released unmitigated just because there's no good use case for it. So it's a good choice to target through mitigation efforts with mining because the mining reduces the emissions. So my idea is if you had some kind of use case where it helps an endangered species or provides some kind of benefit, they could apply for grant funding that's already available for projects like this. But you need some kind of evidence that it's actually going to have a real world effect. So my undergrad final project was working with these guys, the California least tern. They're an endangered migratory bird species in California and northern Mexico. They were listed as endangered in 1970. We started habitat restoration. The numbers went up. And then in 2009, they started to decline again. And they think that's because of climate change. Uh, in the deep ocean, nutrients start upwelling in the spring when it gets warm. The water becomes more nutritious, the plankton population increases, so the fish population increases, and then the bird's migratory schedule is set up to arrive right as the fish species start to arrive. But what's happening now is because it's getting warmer earlier in the year, the fish species are already dying off, and the birds are showing up when there's very low food sources. So they're malnourished, and there's increased predation because they're spending more time harvesting fish. So you're starting to see the chicks die off again. So would removing methane from the environment lower the likelihood of the birds dying off? And if it does, they could apply for funding. So I use presence only prediction to check out the effects mm, of mining on a habitat. So what it does is it looks at the present location of the birds' breeding colonies and climate scenarios. And then it looks at future climate conditions and it can tell where the birds are likely to be located. So I started off with location data from the California Department of Fish and Wildlife. They tag breeding sites from 1990 on, and it updates every year. And they obscure it behind a layer of polygons. So you have like the general area where they're located. And that looks like this. You can see it's kind of along the coast, up in the San Francisco Bay, and then at a few inland sites, most notably at the San Joaquin Valley. And then for the current climate conditions, I use these bioclimate baseline layers developed by climate scientists at a project called CMIP6. It's data from 1970 to 2000, which is kind of used as your current conditions. And then they have data that goes along with that called projections. It's these special report on emission scenarios, they call them. They have these components, a socio-political component, the SSP, and then a number. That's just a different scenario of how well future society can cope with climate change and how well they can cooperate. And then the number after the hyphen is a measure of heating due to greenhouse gases. And then I wanted to look at what would happen to those scenarios if we removed additional methane. So I found this program called Magic that they use to develop the original scenarios. It gives you some spreadsheets and it'll say the gas levels in 2030 are this many megatons, and in 2040 this many, 2050 this many. So I went through and reduced all of those starting in 2030 by 10, 20, or 50% and ran it through program. And your output looks like this. So you can see the unaltered one is up top, and then the version with 10% reduced methane is down below. And it lowered surface temperatures from 1.97 Kelvin to 1.94 Kelvin, about 1.5%. So I used the raster calculator to lower all of the values in the temperature variables by that percentage that it just calculated. So I ended up with these rasters here to run through the presence only prediction. So I have the unaltered scenarios, I have a baseline suitability scenario, and then I have alternate versions of each projection with 10, 20, or 50% reduced atmospheric methane. So this is the baseline analysis. You can see it's a little bit wider than what's actually used according to the CDFW data, which could be because of sampling bias, but it could also just be the animal's preference. They won't use some habitat that is suitable for them for some reason. That's like a frequent thing when you're dealing with animals. There's no way to account for that yet without further study. But this is the first projection, unaltered, 10% reduced, 20% reduced, 50% reduced. And you can see nothing really happened. So in this case, I think precipitation is probably the limiting factor because I left that unaltered. It would make sense if they all live in the Bay Area and in the San Joaquin Valley because there's fresh water there year round. This is the second scenario, unaltered, 10%, 20%, 50%. And you can see everything kind of shifts south as it goes, which is a good thing. That increases the habitat range. So overall species fitness for survival improves under that scenario. In the third scenario, this is with the most severe warming. That's the unaltered, 10% reduced, 20%, and 50%. So you can see there under the 10 and 20% reduced methane emissions, you have suitable habitat pop up in the Bay Area and along the coast that wasn't there. The habitat still isn't great under these scenarios, but range increase like that might be enough to save them from extinction. So this is kind of limited in its application just because peer-reviewed research actually quantifying the amount of methane reduced kind of doesn't exist. Everything that's been going on with the adoption curve, it's just kind of started over the summer, and it's companies throwing in and establishing this. It's not really policy driven, so the research is kind of lagging behind what's actually happening. This also left carbon emissions unchanged. In practice, they're also building solar farms and wind farms, things like that, and then selling the excess energy to the surrounding grid. So carbon emissions are going down too, but that's even harder to quantify because all of those projects, it's one aspect of a much larger project, so you can't really pinpoint how much that's happening. And then I left precipitation unchanged. I don't think you can alter it directly the way I altered the temperature directly. Precipitation is more unpredictable than that. You can't say that temperatures went down, so it's going to rain more. Just doesn't work that way. You'd have to rebuild the rasters from scratch. And I didn't have access to the programs where I could do that, but I think it would be a good thing to do if you're going to invest in this any further. So, in conclusion, reducing methane emissions improves the likelihood of survival for the species under two of the three scenarios. You could expand this to additional scenarios and into additional species. And you could study the animal behavior more, bring in some biologists to determine what makes suitable habitat. Like, according to the scenario, you have habitat that may be useful, but that might not be the case when it comes to the animal's behavior. But I think there's enough here that these projects could use this to apply for grants. So, any questions?